Oke. Selamat sore teman-teman yang sudah berkumpul di ruang Zoom ini. Selamat datang di artikel Twilight Zone, Jakarta International Documentary and Experimental Film Festival 2021. Saya Dini, MC acara untuk hari ini. Good evening, welcome to Archipel Twilight Zone, Jakarta International Documentary and Experimental Film Festival 2020. I am Dini, your MC for today. Before our session begin, I would like to announce for those who need interpreter, you can listen to this panel in Bahasa Indonesia and in English on Zoom. Apologies for those who are watching this on Zoom, on YouTube. We currently don't have the interpreter feature on the platform. We will share the image of the manual on the screen. Yeah, 1 second, please. Yeah, it's now sharing. It's now on screen. For those on Zoom, you can just go to the interpretation button. That is one bar below and click English. And for Bahasa Indonesia speaker, you can click Bahasa Indonesia button. Indonesian button, yeah. There will be 2 interpreters helping today by taking turns translating from Bahasa Indonesia to English and vice versa. And from now on, I will speak in Bahasa Indonesia. Festival ini akan dibuka oleh sambutan singkat dari Direktur Festival kami, Yuki Aditya. Baik, silakan Yuki.
Halo. Halo. Ya. Gambarnya?
Kameranya masih mati, Yuki.
Ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore kawan-kawan semua. Dan terima kasih pada MC kita sore ini, Dini Ada Nurani. Saya Yuki Aditya, Direktur Festival Archipel International Documentary and Experimental Film Festival. Saya ingin berterima kasih menyambut sekaligus secara resmi membuka Archipel Jakarta International Documentary and Experimental Film Festival 2021 Twilight Zone. Tahun ini adalah tahun yang cukup berbeda ya buat kita yang bekerja di Archipel ya. Karena tahun ini kita penyelenggarannya akhirnya memutuskan untuk daring untuk pertama kalinya, dan kami tidak membuka pendaftaran bagi film-film yang untuk mendaftar di program kompetisi internasional atau candrawala. Program tahun ini adalah yang sudah kami persiapkan untuk tahun lalu, untuk Archipel tahun lalu, namun situasi dan kondisi terkait COVID mengharuskan kami mengambil strategi yang berbeda. Kami bahagia tahun ini Archipel dapat terlaksana untuk memutar 9 program kompetisi internasional yang merupakan kurasi dari 1.537 film yang didaftarkan tahun lalu. Lalu juga program candrawala, 2 program kurasi dari kawan kami, Philip Whitman dan Kim Eun-hee, serta program-program pemutaran khusus. Bagi kawan-kawan yang ingin menyaksikan semua program, ya tenang, karena tahun ini kita berjalan selama 3 minggu ya ke depan, dari 28 November untuk pemutaran pertamanya sampai 19 Desember 2021. Lalu kita juga disertai seluruh program itu akan diputar juga secara luar jaringan di bioskop Melenteng, dan untuk selanjutnya untuk semua informasi lengkap terkait Archipel 2021 Twilight Zone bisa diakses di website Archipel di festival.archipel.org. Terima kasih pada kawan-kawan yang telah mendukung penyelenggaraan Archipel sejak pertama kali tahun 2013 sampai sekarang, baik itu institusi pemerintah maupun institusi swasta, lembaga-lembaga kebudayaan, maupun individu-individu yang pernah bersentuhan dengan Archipel dari pertama sampai sekarang. Terima kasih juga banyak kepada kawan-kawan saya di Forum Melenteng yang telah bekerja sangat gigih untuk tahun ini, dan selamat berfestival.
Baik, terima kasih Yuki. Dan selanjutnya sambutan akan diberikan oleh Direktur Artistik kami, Hafiz Rancajale. Ya, bagi Hafiz silakan.
Baik, terima kasih. Selamat sore, selamat pagi buat kawan-kawan dimanapun Anda berada. Terima kasih hari ini kita memulai lagi yang sebuah gelaran yang seharusnya dilaksanakan dari tahun lalu. Kita laksanakan hari ini, mulai hari ini, dan saya dengan senang hati banget dengan hari ini dibuka oleh keynote speech oleh seorang kawan lama, Mei. Selamat datang Mei, terima kasih bersedia untuk menjadi keynote untuk ini. Buat kami Mei adalah seorang pengkaji scholar yang sangat expert di bidang terutama tentang Asia Tenggara, dan kita bisa banyak belajar. Dan tema tahun ini adalah Twilight Zone yang buat kami memang sebelum pandemi telah kami putuskan untuk dengan tema yang sama, tapi dengan adanya pandemi kita melihat bahwa ada keterhubungan persoalan yang bisa kita relasikan dengan persoalan pandemi dan Twilight Zone. Nah, hari ini kita akan mendengar pidato kunci dari Mei Adadol yang menurut saya sangat relevan untuk melihat bagaimana kita kawasan ini, Asia Tenggara ataupun dimanapun Anda berada, melihat kemungkinan-kemungkinan sinema atau yang tersembunyi di balik kawasan-kawasan yang tidak pernah terbaca sebelumnya. Bagi saya event ini adalah event penting buat melihat bagaimana perkembangan seni kontemporer dan juga film, dan buat kita Archipel akan terus mencoba untuk mencari kemungkinan-kemungkinan untuk bisa digagas dan ditawarkan ke publik. Selamat berfestival, selamat menikmati, dan semoga saja insight dari kawan-kawan dari Forum Festival selama 2 hari ini dan juga festival secara online maupun secara luring yang akan diadakan di sinema bioskop Forum Lenteng. Semoga saja kawan-kawan dapat bisa mendapat inspirasi atau gagasan-gagasan yang bisa membuat hidup kita lebih baik untuk melewati pandemi ini. Terima kasih banyak. Selamat mendengarkan.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih, Hafiz. Kita akan melanjutkan acara ke pidato kunci oleh Mei Adadol Ingawani yang sudah ditunggu-tunggu pastinya. Sesi diskusi dari pidato ini akan dimoderatori oleh Prasasti Wilujeng Putri, Koordinator Forum Festival. Layar akan saya serahkan kepada Prasasti dan saya undur diri. Selamat menyaksikan dan terima kasih. Oke, selamat sore para hadirin Forum Festival Archipel 2021. Saya Prasasti Wilujeng Putri, Koordinator Forum Festival. Senang sekali menyambut Anda semua yang telah hadir di pertemuan virtual kita hari ini. Dan terima kasih sekali atas kehadiran teman-teman semua. Setelah setahun, Archipel Jakarta International Documentary and Experimental Film Festival ditunda karena pandemi COVID-19. Dan akhirnya di tahun ini kita bisa berfestival lagi dengan cara online. Dan memang sepertinya keadaan sudah lebih aman, namun akan lebih aman lagi kami rasa untuk melaksanakan Archipel dengan cara online. Dan film-film dalam berbagai program kuratorial dan kompetisi internasional dapat diakses di festival.archipel.org. Silakan registrasi dan film-film dapat disaksikan secara gratis. Setelah selama setahun membicarakan zona yang temaram, akan tepat bagi Forum Festival Archipel 2021 untuk membicarakan apa yang terjadi pada zona tersebut. Mungkin pada zona tersebut terjadi masa inkubasi, dan inkubasi adalah kata-kata yang sering sekali ya kita dengar di masa pandemi ini, yang artinya adalah selang waktu yang menjadi penentu apakah sesuatu akan berlipat ganda dan menyerang, dan ataukah ia akan mati. Pada masa inkubasi terjadi kemungkinan-kemungkinan pada substrat yang berada dalam ruang gelap dan yang tidak akan terjadi pada ruang yang disinari cahaya matahari. Dan untuk itu, Forum Festival tahun ini akan membicarakan soal apa yang muncul dari sebuah krisis. Ia bisa berupa estetika bahasa sinema, ia bisa berupa bentuk baru berjejaring, dan estetika sendiri juga berkaitan erat dengan cara menonton kita hari ini, dan oleh karena itu juga berkaitan dengan teknologinya.
Dan walaupun teknologi internet telah marak digunakan sejak awal 2000-an, pandemi membuat teknologi berkembang semakin pesat ya. Dan penggunaannya semakin marak dan masif digunakan sehingga turut memberikan kontribusi besar kepada perubahan cara menonton sekarang dan juga perubahan cara manusia menjalani hidupnya. Perkembangan teknologi dan perubahan moda persepsi tersebut dapat mengemansipasi saat ia dipakai sebagai alat untuk mencurigai realitas sehingga berpotensi memunculkan daya kritis. Dan kritisisme dalam bentuk bagaimana manusia bersikap terhadap teknologi melahirkan aksi-aksi yang merayakan teknologi tersebut dalam rangka mengkritisi pemilik modal yang menguasai data, sumber daya, seperti memakai konsep berjejaring juga yang mendemistifikasi kuasa dalam penggunaan internet yang eksploitatif. Perubahan mode persepsi ini juga merupakan tantangan tersendiri ya. Biasanya gerakan sosial banyak menuntut gerakan fisik, akan tetapi dengan adanya krisis ini, konsep gerakan sosial juga harus ditinjau kembali. Dan dengan ruang gerak yang terbatas, gerakan sosial yang ada digital, sesuatu yang tadinya hanya dianggap sebagai pelengkap, sekarang menjadi peristiwa utama. Banyak gerakan di Indonesia, dari dapur umum hingga pertukaran informasi di media sosial, mengingatkan bahwa manusia dapat hidup dengan sistem yang ia buat sendiri, tanpa harus bersitegang dengan sistem dominan, dan juga tanpa harus menganggap bahwa sistem kecil ini adalah sesuatu yang lain. Karena nyatanya sistem kecil yang ini lebih kontekstual, dan membuat kita resisten untuk tetap hidup. Dan sistem kecil yang tidak selalu sejalan dengan asas-asas modernisme yang orientatif dan selalu ingin berprogres, dan yang ingin menjadikan semua hal berada di dalam suatu kuasa. Dan pidato kunci oleh May Adadol Ingawanich akan membuka forum festival kita tahun ini. May adalah seorang penulis, kurator, dan pengajar. Dia fokus pada sejarah dan genealogi seni sinematik yang terdewesternisasi dan terdesentralisasi. Ia juga fokus pada warisan avant-garde di Asia Tenggara, fokus pada bentuk, potensi, dan masa depan dalam praktik seni dan kuratorial kontemporer, estetika dan sirkulasi seniman movie image, seni dan film independen di sekitar dan terkait dengan Asia Tenggara. Tema penelitian dan pengajaran utamanya bersinggungan dengan studi film dan media, sejarah seni, praktik kuratorial, penelitian artistik, dan studi kawasan. Ia sekarang adalah seorang profesor Cinematic Arts dan co-director di Center for Research and Education in Arts and Media. Melalui berbagai bentuk publikasi dan inisiatif penelitian kuratorial, karya May diakui atas kontribusinya terhadap studi dan praktik musik image dari para seniman Asia Tenggara, seni kontemporer, dan sinema independen. Penelitiannya secara kreatif mengembangkan metode dekolonial untuk mempelajari sejarah dan silsilah praktik sinematik dan artistik, dan untuk melakukan penelitian artistik dan kuratorial yang terletak di dan terkait dengan Asia Tenggara. Berdasarkan praktik-praktiknya, kami rasa May tepat untuk membawakan materi kunci pada forum festival tahun ini. Halo May. Hi May. So the screen is yours. You can start your presentation.
Thank you, Asti. And thank you, Hafiz and Yuki. Hi, everybody. It's a real honor to be able to be part of Archipel this year. I was at Archipel in person in 2015. I have very happy memories of joining that festival at that time. So it's a real pleasure to be able to do it again. And I hope soon in the future, we will be able to do this in person. So my talk today will be based on a curatorial project that I initiated with a lot of collaborators, the key person being the film programmer and art historian, Julian Ross. And this is a curatorial research project and platform called Animistic Apparatus. As I talk, I hope you'll see the connections between Animistic Apparatus and some of the key ideas underscoring the themes of Archipel this year and also from last year, particularly two things. One is the idea of the twilight zone as a place of uncertainty. So the twilight zone as a place where we do things, we try to make things happen in a great state of uncertainty and vulnerability. So one of the key questions that I'm interested in as a theorist, as a teacher, and as a curator is what are the conditions of possibility of the agency of people who are powerless, who are trying to do things in a condition where they are powerless and in a great state of uncertainty. And the second key theme where I think animistic apparatus links nicely with the idea of the twilight zone is the idea of cinema as a sphere of encounter in an enlarged sense. So the other thing that interests me is the history of practices of cinema and the idea of cinema as a possibility of encounter, and including the kind of encounters where it's not just a case of humans encountering other humans. So cinema as a space of enlarged encounter, including encounters between humans and non-humans. Cinema as a space and a sphere of encounter in a more cosmological sense. So I'm going to share my screen with you and call up my PowerPoint slides. I am doing this talk by showing you a lot of slides and talking to you live without a script, partly to keep it informal, but it also means that at any time, if you have questions, if you want me to go through a point again, if you want to just pause and chat with me about the particular point I'm making, please feel free to put it in the chat box, and then I will keep an eye on the chat box as well. And also, this is to the interpreters. Thank you very much for doing this for me. And I know it's especially exciting when you have to do it live with no script. So please feel free to put things in chat box as well if you want me to go over a point again. Okay, so Animistic Apparatus is a curatorial project I initiated a couple of years ago. And it's a project that explores the affinity between cinema and animism. And it explores that by drawing inspiration from a certain practice of film projection, which started taking place in Thailand and in other places in Southeast Asia as well, sometime in the 20th century. And this is a practice where films are projected in ritual contexts. Films are projected as a way to communicate with spirit. So I'm going to start by showing a short video made for me as part of a field trip, which myself and quite a lot of my collaborators and friends did in 2015 to the northeast of Thailand to look at practices of outdoor film projection around that time. This artist is called Thanachai Bandasak. So Thanachai went traveling with me and quite a lot of other people to look at outdoor film projection. And after that trip, he did me this very nice 3-minute video as a kind of diary of our time there and a documentation of the practices that we were traveling around and immersing ourselves in. So can we please start with that video? So Tanachai's video is a documentation of a film projection event that took place one evening within the campus ground of a university in the northeast of Thailand, a university called Khon Kaen. Those of you who like Apichatpong Wirasethagun's films might be a little bit familiar, more familiar than you think, with the atmosphere of the spaces of this region and this university. This was the university where Apichatpong did his first degree in architecture in Thailand. It's a very huge campus. It's like a mini town. And there is one bit of land on this campus where film projection takes place. This bit of land on this campus, it is said, is presided over by a local spirit. So the sovereign of this bit of land on this university campus is a spirit known colloquially as Chao Po. Chao Po in Thai can mean a spirit presiding over a particular place, a male spirit, or can also mean a mafia. So Chao Po's spirit is the boss of this bit of land. It is said that Chao Po's spirit likes movies. So what happens on this piece of land is if somebody wishes for something, so if there is a student who wishes to get good grades in their exams, they can go and make a pledge to Chao Po on this land, and they can promise that if they get good grades, then they will make an offering to Chao Po. They will show 1 movie, 2 movies, 3 movies. So the film projection will then take place if the host, so somebody who makes a wish to Chao Po, wants to make good on the promise that is made. So they get what they want, and then in return, they commission an outdoor itinerant film projectionist to come and show however many films they promised to this spirit. What really first struck me and my collaborators when we went and observed, immersed ourselves in some of these film projection events taking place on these sort of locally potent sites, is there is a very intriguing question here. And the question can be asked quite simply, but the answer is more complex than you think. The question is simply, who was at the screening? Because as you saw from that little video, there were no human spectators at these screenings, which took the form of offerings to spirits. And this is it's not unusual, it's quite common. So film projection as offering would take place, and it wouldn't be necessary for the host to be there. It wouldn't be necessary for that projection to have anybody there witnessing it at all. But which still leaves us with the question of who was there? And is it accurate to say if no humans were there watching this projection event, nobody was there? So that was the starting point of my fascination with a certain kind of film projection event, with this history, this genealogy of outdoor film projection event taking place around Thailand and elsewhere as well, which didn't really fit into the usual film historical narrative of what cinema is, what it is for, and under what circuits or what conditions are films projected. So that was my starting point, the genesis, if you like, the origins of doing Animistic Apparatus as a curatorial research project. This image is just to give you a picture of the projection apparatus that gets used in order to project films outdoors in the northeast of Thailand. And it's a mode of projection which is very DIY. As you can see, the projection base is on a truck, and the truck gets used by the projectionists and the technicians to take them to the site where they're commissioned to do projection events. The truck is used for them to sleep on, to eat on, and you can see that the projection apparatus itself is pretty DIY. In this case, this was an image taken in 2015. The projector itself consists of a stack of two projectors that anyone would be able to buy and use at home. The lumen for each projector isn't very high. So what the projectionist technician has to know how to do is to create a stack system where you're able to project images and enlarge them on a pretty large screen. So all this is very DIY. So this phenomenon of projecting films outdoors to spirits, projecting films in ritual contexts, then it got me thinking about what cinema is when cinema isn't necessarily art, when films are not necessarily made for commercial purposes or propaganda purposes. So these are usually the three pillars of film history and film theorizing, right? What is cinema? What is it for? Cinema is art. Cinema is a commercial product. Cinema has been used politically, is used politically as part of propaganda. I started thinking more about the intertwining of cinema and ritual practices. So my question, my starting point was thinking about, well, what if cinema is and has been in certain places in the world part of ritual practice? How could I research that? And what would be an appropriate form that this research could take? So things that I then came across with this lens, a slightly different lens of looking at the history of cinema as ritual practice, are such as this advertisement from a Thai language newspaper. This I found in a library. The newspaper itself is from the early 1960s. And I was very fascinated by this image in the newspaper. And this is in the entertainment pages of the newspaper. The news basically says that these three men, the filmmaker, the director, and the producers of this particular film, made sometime in the early 1960s. They took the reels, celluloid reels of the film that they had just made, which was about to be released in cinemas. They took that to a Buddhist monk at the temple to ask the monk to bless the reels of films, to try to ensure that the film would be successful when it was commercially released in cinemas. So this image is one example of the way that the commercial production of film also incorporated ritual dimension, this improvised practice, of taking celluloid reels to a Buddhist monk and to have those reels as part of a blessing ritual, in the hope that that would help you secure a better outcome for your film. To me, the really interesting question here when I look at this image is, so this ritual of blessing the celluloid reel, is that traditional practice or is that modern practice? Or does that distinction no longer hold when you look at this image? Another example, this I took from a photo display board at a place in a little village right on the Mekong River, so right on the border of Northeast Thailand and Laos. The place is now a hipster cafe, or was a hipster cafe. The last time I was there would have been about 5-6 years ago now. And this cafe is situated where there used to be a neighborhood cinema, so the main neighborhood cinema for that village. So they have a lot of old projection gears that they display, lots of photos from back in the day when the space used to be a neighborhood cinema. And amongst the photos that they displayed, these are photos from early 1960s when the cinema was had just opened up. The photos of the crowds going to see a particularly popular action film at that time. The photos you see on the right-hand side are photos from a ritual of blessing the cinema space and blessing the 35mm projector, which the owners of the cinema did at the point of the cinema opening. Again, in order to try to ensure the auspicious and successful career of their cinema. So again, that's another example of the way that cinematic practice and ritual practice became very intertwined. The same question as the last slide. What does this image speak of? Does it speak of tradition, traditional practice, or does this image of a monk blessing the 35mm projector speak of modern practice, or does that distinction no longer apply? Another example of the relationship, the intertwining of cinematic practice and ritual practice. This is an altar, beautifully arranged altar in a ritual making an ancestral offering. And the ancestor in this case is somebody who was active in cinema and in theatrical performance in Thailand or Siam at that time, from the late 1920s to I think just to the start of the Second World War. His stage name was Tit Kieo, and he is described as somebody who pioneered the practice of performing voices live to Thai films. So he was a kind of, if you know the term benshi from Japanese cinema, he was like the Siamese benshi person. This image was taken about 10 years ago by somebody who was doing research assistance for me, looking at practices of film projection in the south of Thailand and tracing down people who used to work as voice performers accompanying film projection. And in the process of that, she followed a group of people who used to work as voice performers to one of their events, which they hold annually. And it's an event which makes a ritual offering to this ancestral figure for their performance art, put it that way. So every year these retired voice performers would get together and make a ritual offering to Titkio, who they hold up, they invoke as the teacher stroke ancestor to their line of artistic practice. So again, the same question applies. This practice, it looks traditional. Is it traditional? It echoes the logic of making offerings to your ancestors. But is it a mark of tradition or mark of modernity for a group of people to hold up this guy as their ancestor, as their sort of first teacher? So coming across scattered remains and scattered archives of this genealogy of the intertwining of cinema and ritual practices, then got me thinking about how to do this research and what would be the possibilities of translating the genealogies that I was coming across into a form of research which would be less conventional. So how can I do this research into the relationship between cinema and ritual in a way that didn't necessarily lead me to writing academic books or articles? Yeah, that wasn't necessarily a kind of research within the discipline of art and anthropology. So it was at this point that I started thinking, well, how can I make a curatorial platform? Yeah, how can I do curatorial research, drawing inspiration from this genealogy in order to ask again this fundamental question: what is cinema? What is it for? So then I started thinking about just this scene of cinematic apparatus. Outdoors, in the dark, projection takes place, but the projection doesn't take place in a way that depends on there being any human spectators there. So what can I do with this? And just to give you another example of a parallel kind of projection practice in Southeast Asia, in the region, Hungry Ghost Festival. Yeah, it's sort of ancestral offering festival. Also has a similar dynamic to the practices in Thailand of projecting films to spirits in order to pay back the spirit for something that you'd asked for. In the case of the Hungry Ghost Festival, the logic of this ritual is a little bit more, you do this as a way to make an offering to ancestors. How can I translate these sorts of practices into a curatorial project? One area within academic scholarship which fed my thinking quite productively is this area of current academic theorizing and debate within anthropology and to a certain extent within philosophy on returning again to the concept of animism and thinking again, well, what is animism? And the example that I give here is in a book with a collection of articles written by anthropologists, basically theorizing, well, what is Southeast Asian animism? And what is the sort of regional characteristics of animism in Southeast Asia? It's a pretty interesting book because in some of the articles, you have anthropologists who were researching animism in Southeast Asia in the 1970s, let's say, who then return to their fieldwork that material from a couple of decades ago to theorize again what they think animism is, doing this in dialogue with the current post-humanist discourse on animism, on what is the ontology of human, non-human relations, those sorts of things. And the interesting idea that I got from this field of discussion is the idea that Southeast Asian animism is a kind of communicational practice, whereby there is a hierarchy of communication. Humans who are the who make the utterance, who are the enunciators, that's the sort of technical term drawing from literary theory. So humans who make the offerings, who initiate this communication, are the powerless ones, are the precarious ones. And this animistic ritual of communication, humans communicate through a ritualistic logic that addresses spirits as powerful beings. So humans are the powerless ones, and this sort of opaque sovereign being of local spirits are the sort of the power who are addressed by animistic practices of communication. So you can see that the ritual of film projection to spirits echo this logic quite exactly. And in that scenario, you might say that in the scenario of film projection, the spectator, the addressee of this projection event is non-human, right? The spectator, that in that scenario of outdoor film projection, there is a spectator, the spectator is non-human. And Southeast Asian animism then becomes a kind of cosmological communication practice, whereby people who are precarious and vulnerable make actions, enact certain rituals, often improvised rituals of communication in order to try to get something. And in that idea, in order to try to get something, the implication is that animism as communication practice is a practice whereby people who are vulnerable make these utterances to powerful beings in order to try to enhance the possibilities of there being some kind of a future for themselves. So theoretically, you could also say that animism is a kind of cosmological communication practice and a kind of future-making practice, whereby the agency of enacting that practice are vulnerable people. So this is what interests me about this model of Southeast Asian animism. It's not a model that is interested in the idea that all objects are living beings and that agency is non-human. I think this is the key distinction. What is interesting to think with around this idea of Southeast Asian animism is the question of the agency of powerless and vulnerable humans, and how people take up symbolic practices of communication in a cosmological sense, in order to try to imagine some kind of future. So sometime in 2019, I thought I'd experiment with trying to find a research form for animistic apparatus, a curatorial research form. So what I did with my dear collaborators, Julian Ross, also Mary Pansanga, and Mary has been at Archipel, I believe, in recent years. What we did was we organized an artistic research trip. We called it an artistic research lab and a field learning trip to the same area in Northeast Thailand that myself and collaborators had previously just sort of traveled around, did some research in. And we took, it ended up being 40 people, quite a lot more than we'd initially planned. So we took with us artists, curators, anthropologists, art writers, mostly from within Southeast Asia, to spend nearly a week in this region, getting a feel for sites which are said to be under the sort of sovereignty of local spirits, getting to know an outdoor itinerant film projection troupe who I had been interacting with as I was doing my earlier phase of research. So interacting with them and basically commissioning them to set up their apparatus for a couple of nights and to teach the group how to work with these apparatus, but this time more in the spirit of artistic experimentation. So what could we as artistic and creative people do with the projection tools of this itinerant projectionist troupe, who sometimes got commissioned to make these animistic film projections. What could we do with those tools? What can we do on the spaces where this troupe would sometimes be commissioned to organize animistic film projection? So off we went to a province called Udon Thani in the northeast of Thailand, with no plan in mind, really. No performance rehearsed beforehand, no schedule of what we would show. We just go and then see what we could do. We had some participants from Indonesia. We had artist Ria Rizaldi, who I'm sure a lot of you know, and we had Umi Lestari also on the trip with us. So this slide that I'm showing you is a photo that I took from the roadside. So you see the highway, and then there's a turnoff, and the red sign above says that it's a shrine. So there's a little turnoff, and you go to a shrine. Again, this is a sort of animistic shrine, a shrine to a spiritus mafia, a grandfather spirit, a spirit locally seen to have spiritual ownership of this particular bit of land. And here you see at the bottom of the sign that particular evening, what was going to be happening at this shrine was the projection of 4 horror films done as a way to make an offering to this grandfather spirit. So the projectionist just in the afternoon before this was due to take place, just turned up with 4 photocopied posters of the films that would be projected as an offering to the spirit that evening. And one really, really fascinating thing about this practice of projecting films to spirit is that quite often the logic of selecting films, the usual logic doesn't apply. So it's not the case that the host, the person who commissions this projection, would have an idea or an interest in choosing which films to show. But what is important for the efficiency, the efficacy of this ritual practice is that is the number of films that you show. So if you promise the spirit that you will show 4 films, because you've made this big wish, and you promise the spirit that if you get this wish, you will pay back in a big way. You promise to show 4 films, then you have to show 4 films. So the logic of projection here, what is an efficient, effective projection, has much more to do with the number of films that is promised and that is subsequently shown. And it has far less to do with choosing the genre or the title. Sometimes the work of choosing the title is just left to the projectionist troupe. That the host says, well, you can choose whatever, but just make sure you show 4 films, because I promised 4 films to the spirits. So the group of 40 of us were going around Udon Thani province, sometimes just seeing the site, animistic shrine and land surrounding it, talking to the medium who looks after that site. We had a couple of evenings, we had 3 evenings in total, where we asked this projectionist troupe to set up their tools and to teach us how to use their tools so that we could experiment with making something happen that evening. One site we borrowed was a neighborhood Buddhist temple that you see here. This is in the afternoon when we'd turn up, and the projectionist troupe would set up 2 screens for us, one big one, one small one. Their projectors, they had a range because this particular troupe is owned by a very talented technician and also a collector of film projectors himself. So he has in his archive a collection of film projectors from the analog era through to his invention, his digital invention, sort of stacks of projectors that where you could use quite low cost projectors, buy a couple of them and stack them so that you're still able to get good, big, clear images projected onto the large screen. So this is just to give you another image of the projection apparatus as it was being set up. And this was the other site where we got permission to use. It's just a large open site that got very dark at night in a village called Bantian. So again, you see that the definition of what the apparatus here in this case is, it includes a multi-purpose projection truck and an audio basically controls center all in the truck. Maybe you also get a sense here. The question, is this projection apparatus something of the digital era or the analog era? Again, that question is unclear, because although they're using digital projectors these days, so analog is no longer used, partly because it's much more difficult to obtain celluloid reels now. But the scaffolding to make the screen, the sound system, that's still something that carries over from what this projection troupe was using in the analog era. So there's a sort of, in this DIY spirit that they have of repairing tools, maintaining tools, and reinventing tools through the decades, that was also very interesting to me, the way that these projection troupes making animistic film projections were also experts in repair and maintenance, and were also people who were the agents of very much complicating and blurring the idea of cinema as something that had its analog era and that is now in its digital era. Whether this phenomenon is analog or digital is pretty unclear. So just some images of what we ended up improvising during the 3 nights that we had to basically fool around with the logic of animistic film projection and with the apparatus that the projectionists would use. So one night, what ended up happening was a kind of improvised performance and collaboration between a media arts and performance arts collective called Lullaby, 2 artists from Taiwan. Ria was involved in this moment. Ria was up on the projection truck doing sort of coding and manipulating the sound. And as Ria was doing that, one member of Lullaby, Charlene, who herself is a Tai Chi master and whose artistic practice involves experimenting with creating Tai Chi moves from the way that people use digital devices. That's one of her long-standing sort of artistic research practice. So in this case, she adapted that idea, drew inspiration from this animistic projection apparatus and improvised Tai Chi moves around the screen, around this sort of territory of film projection, while other people, other artists were on the truck playing around with projecting images to sync with her moves and also playing around with manipulating the sound to go with her moves. That improvisation very organically took place at another evening, which shifted the site then. This took place on that big ground in Banqiang village, which at night got very, very dark. And here there was just one point in the evening, quite late, where Charlene, again, started improvising Tai Chi moves, responding to just the presence of this screen and the scaffolding and the big speakers in the dark. So she started improvising Tai Chi moves, responding to that, and then that turned into a kind of class. She got people to just come into the radius, the space of the projection screen to do the moves with her. So after the time spent, about a week spent in Northeast Thailand doing this artistic research and improvisation lab, I then got an invitation by a film festival called Beric Film and Media Arts Festival, which is a really great festival for artists' moving image, and quite an anti-establishment festival in many ways. It's a festival that takes place in England, but it doesn't take place in a big city. So Beric itself is a little town, very small town, right on the border between England and Scotland. So it has a strong identity as a sort of borderland film festival, which values selecting and showing the kind of moving images which might be seen as marginal or not part of the mainstream. And it's also a town which is it's on the coast, very beautiful coast, and it's where a river meets the sea. So the town itself has very beautiful geographical spots and settings, and also has quite a lot of architectural ruins from dating back from hundreds of years ago when the English were fighting the Scots. So there are sort of lots of sort of military forts and ruins from the pre-modern period when the English and Scots were fighting. So I got an invitation to see if I could translate some of these ideas of Animistic Apparatus as a curatorial platform to be part of the Beric Film and Media Arts Festival in 2019. So eventually I came up with a way of doing this, and as in the form of an exhibition taking place outside of the Southeast Asia, in a place which would not necessarily have this sort of the same genealogy of ritual practice, let's say. But of course, in all places in the world would have some kind of genealogy of ritual practice, whether that's remembered or forgotten. So I translated Animistic Apparatus for Beric into a speculative exhibition, just posing this question: what if exhibitions weren't addressed to humans? So that was my way of framing how I contributed to the festival that year through a number of moving image installations placed around the town, in specific sites around the town, in some cases within the sort of ruins of military towers. So I did that and wrote a curatorial text to frame our action, myself and my team's action of doing that, as a kind of speculative gesture of exhibition making, posing this question: well, what if these installations were placed there, but not as an exhibition which anticipates there being human spectators? So how could we create these moving image installations around the town of Beric as if they're part of a kind of offering rituals where humans aren't exactly invited to be part of that ritual? There is no need for humans to be in the moment of that ritual, but humans are not necessarily excluded from experiencing that ritual either. So this was just a way of sort of shifting the place of the human in the process of artistic production and exhibition. What if the place of the humans were just as precarious and wishful makers of offerings, not as the artist, not as the author, and not as the spectator, where the festival organizer then collates data about who came and how many people came? What if we displaced the place of the human from the scenario of artistic production and exhibition? And this is just to give you one example of the projection event that we did. So as part of this sort of speculative framing of Animistic Apparatus, the exhibition at Beric Film and Media Arts Festival, I then programmed an outdoor projection of one of the films by Filipino filmmaker Lav Diaz, who's notorious for making very long films, right? Or at least that, up until quite recently, has been his reputation. So this is a film called A Lullaby to the Sorrowful Mystery, which is about 10 hours long. And with Beric Festival, we decided to try describing this event as a ritual of film projection, making an offering to the non-human beings of Beric. And we programmed it so that the projection would take place in a little park by the sea. The projection event would begin around after sunset, and this being September, so late summer in the UK, the sun sets late, so about 9 p.m., which meant that the film would then end with the sun rising. And it would play through the night as a kind of a ritual of offering, without being particularly concerned with whether there would be people who would come to this projection event or not. or whether people would be able to stay to the end. So we just shifted the logic, experimented with shifting the logic of presenting Love Diaz's long film to echo the question that the animistic apparatus overall asks: what if exhibitions aren't necessarily addressed to humans? I think I'm going to, I think I'll end there, but maybe I'll leave this slide up. And this slide is just to give you a flavor of the sorts of contemporary artistic works that are being made now that draw inspiration from sort of this animistic approaches, animistic genealogy of media, moving image projection. And this image comes from work produced a couple of years ago by an artist called Beric, who's very, very fascinated by this the northeastern Thai genealogy of film projection, and he turns that into various forms of media arts work, performances, installations, and so on. So look out for his work. You can probably find quite a lot of excerpts of his work online. Okay, so I think I'm going to finish there. Maybe I'll stop my screen share. It looks like I'm just calling up chat and Q&A, which I think there are some comments and questions there.
Ya, Mei, mungkin I will speak in bahasa Indonesia.
Okay, let me just switch on English. Okay.
Ya, sebelum kita ke Q&A session, mungkin aku bisa membicarakan apa yang aku tadi dapat gitu, bahwa dengan mengatakan bahwa praktik-praktik animistik itu adalah lived practice gitu, berarti kita bisa mengatakan bahwa praktik-praktik itu adalah pengetahuan, dan kemudian filmmaker dan seniman membuat spekulasi lagi gitu ya dari pengetahuan yang ada di tubuh-tubuh yang nggak bisa dilembagakan dan tidak bisa disimpan ini gitu. Karena beda ya dengan pengetahuan yang mungkin sifatnya dokumen yang bisa disimpan, yang bisa disensor, dimanipulasi, diubah gitu. Dan dengan demikian juga sejarah juga dapat diubah gitu sesuai dengan kebutuhan orang yang berkuasa. Mungkin menganalisis hal-hal semacam ini gitu, soal praktik yang menubuh, yang tidak terdokumentasi ini gitu, itu melepas objektivitas gitu, karena di sini mode-mode pengalaman terhadap dunia gitu, termasuk emosi, termasuk tubuh, soal yang suci gitu, itu jadi fokus gitu, dan ini yang seringkali diingkari oleh penelitian yang bersifat positivistik dan rasionalistik ya, dan memperformkan mode kehidupan yang seperti ini gitu, itu juga sangat politis gitu, dimana sesuatu yang tidak punya power dapat berkomunikasi untuk mengadres powerful being. Mungkin itu dulu dari aku. Ada dua penanya, mungkin aku akan bacakan juga untuk keperluan dokumentasi. Yang pertama dari Lutfan Nur Rahman. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting and, as I might say, beautiful discourse that you offer. I happen to read your paper on itinerant cinema that I assume become the basis of this practice a long ago. I've encountered the word to make shift cinema as an apparatus towards dispositive. Can you elaborate on that? And it's interesting how you use or counter-use the term apparatus in this animistic apparatus. The second question is regarding the Cold War context. How this event become a turning point for the Southeast Asia region in terms of thinking or artistic practice? Because I see this practice as a counter for the established narrative in the world for so long, for developing countries and so on. And dan pertanyaan kedua dari Anggra. Hello, I am Anggra. I am curious, is there any particular historical background in Udon Thani that enable practices that situate cinema or cinematic experience as an offering to deity? I noticed that you capture Hungry Ghost Festival in Malaysia, which has similar as well. In your findings, is there any particular background that links such practice within this region? And the second one is, if we can consider the dark room as the materialization of a certain myth or knowledge regarding cinematic apparatus, which eventually constructs our vision about the infrastructure of cinema, perhaps we can also read itinerant cinema and animistic apparatus also as a way to materialize this marginalized knowledge about cinematic apparatus. My question is more like curiosity about how will we envision future cinematic infrastructure, especially today that we have encountered constraints and challenges in the pandemic situation. How will you envision it related to the animistic apparatus? Okay, May, you can answer the question.
Okay, thank you, Luthvan. Maybe I'll try to answer what I can one by one. Luthvan and Angraya. Okay, so the first question, Luthvan's question about the idea of the apparatus and the shift from the theoretical term apparatus to dispositive. So just for those who aren't familiar with this article that I wrote, I'm just going to type the name of the journal, which is called Southeast of Now. And it's an article, I'm sorry, whose full title I've forgotten already, but go to Southeast of Now, search May Ingawanit, and you'll see the article. It was from 2018, and it will be open access, so everyone can read it. So this article was my first attempt to write about this genealogy of outdoor film projection in Cold War period, largely in Thailand. And in my theorization, I took on the term dispositif to shift away from the idea of the cinema apparatus. And that was my effort to differentiate the practices of film projection, histories of film projection in Thailand, from an established way of thinking about the film projection apparatus and the history of film projection, which, when it first became theorized in film studies in the 1970s, very much assumed that the apparatus refers to a scenario of film projection inside a cinema, in a darkened auditorium, with the projector being set in a certain way. This was very key to the founding of film studies as a big deal academic discipline, very key to the Western psychoanalytic approach to theorizing how does cinema and its mechanisms of projection create subjects. So my agenda there, and at the point when I was researching this, writing this paper in 2018, I wasn't doing anything particularly rebellious, let's say, in shifting the terminology from film apparatus to dispositif. And dispositif became proposed as a way to think about what the apparatus was, what the apparatus could be in specific and localized contexts. So dispositif carries with it this notion of improvisation, this notion that what makes a scenario of film projection and spectatorship possible had a lot of different elements which couldn't necessarily be predicted in advance. So there wasn't necessarily a formula that you could draw on to theorize film projection. So that was the big shift from the idea of the apparatus as cinema being projected in a certain way inside a darkened auditorium, where it created a sense of you as being the only person being addressed by the screen. Shifting away from that to a terminology of the apparatus as something that then would force you to have to think harder about, well, what are the actual elements in place to make projection, to enable projection at a certain point, in a certain time, in a certain place. And then from that very specific situated description of the dispositif of projection, how then would you theorize what cinema is? So in this article, the way that I had a lot of fun describing what the dispositif actually was in outdoor itinerant film projection in Cold War Thailand. My definition included a rice cooker, for instance, because projectors and technicians were traveling around and needed to cook rice in order to make the projection events happen. Second question regarding the Cold War context. I'm not quite sure. I'm not entirely sure whether I would need to add to an answer to that comment. I think it's pretty complete as it is. So now I've moved on. I'm reading Angra's comment. Comment number one. What are the possible links between, let's say, animistic projection in Udon Thani and Hungry Ghost Festival? Are there particular backgrounds that links those practices? That's a great research question for someone. I would love to know as well. Myself, I don't know, but that to me comes across as a pretty good first question for some kind of a postgraduate or PhD research project. So I have lots and lots of questions I haven't been able to find answers to. Where else in Southeast Asia did animistic film projection take place? Where else in other regions of the world were there comparable phenomena? What enabled that practice to take place at specific sites in certain times? So great. There are lots and lots more research that can be done about this. And I think what you're posting there is a pretty good starting point for some kind of a research project. And then your second question, I think your second question links with the comment that Asti also made. And it's really, the key issue here is what knowledge base we draw on, right? To practice artistically, practice curatorially, to practice research. In the phenomenon that I drew inspiration from, it's not as easy as it might seem when you think about how would you describe that kind of knowledge. And that's why I kept emphasizing that the distinction between tradition and modernity in those scenarios of ritual treatment of film projection, the distinction really doesn't hold. And what's being implied there is somebody might loosely and carelessly call this, describe those practices as instances of indigenous knowledge. But what on earth does indigenous mean in this case, right? People who commission film projectionists to make projection events for spirits, addressed to spirits, can you necessarily assume that they're acting according to certain indigenous logic? So I think one of the key underlying conceptual questions here, which has to be handled with a lot of sophistication and a lot of care and nuance is how you think about what kind of a knowledge this is that underscores this unusual cinematic practice that wasn't quite commercial, although there is a commercial dimension, wasn't propaganda, wasn't necessarily artistic, although I do think there's such a close relationship between art and ritual forms, right? So how to characterize the status of knowledge of these practices, I think it's one of these sort of underlying fascinations for me. And it's a question that's actually very, very difficult to answer and shouldn't be answered by careless use of such notions as indigenous or local, because immediately you have to ask yourself, well, what does indigenous mean in this case? Okay, so I hope I've managed to extend some of your really great thoughts there. Thank you very much. And I hope I've managed to do what I can to add to that.
Yeah, May, there is a question on YouTube, and I will read it on Bahasa Indonesia.
Okay.
Pertanyaan ini dari Adi Osman dari Sumatera Barat. Dia bertanya, dalam tradisi ritual terhadap roh, ada kesadaran atas kerentanan atau vulnerability manusia, atas kerentanan manusia. Dalam konteks eksibisi, bagaimana bentuk kesadaran vulnerability itu? Pertanyaan kedua, apakah vulnerability disadari dalam konteks dalam twilight zone, dalam pasar atau pandemik atau oppressive state dan seterusnya? Terima kasih. Silakan, May.
Thank you, Adi. I'm going to type the name of another article that I wrote, which I think I'll talk about the article in a minute, but let me type this first so I don't forget. And it's called Stories of Animistic Cinema, published in a journal called Antennae, open access again. And this is a special issue of the journal on called Uncontainable Natures. So human, non-human practices and visual culture in Southeast Asia. Two special issues edited by artist Lucy Davis, art historians Nora Taylor and Kevin Chua. Really, really well worth reading and open access, so everybody can just download it. And this article I wrote after I did the Animistic Apparatus field trip. And I wrote it in a way that was more drawing inspiration from the storytelling that we were encountering all the time. Those who have been involved with this sort of animistic logic of film apparatus tend to also be extremely good storytellers. So I was writing this piece in a more creative way, telling one story after the other of scenarios of cinema as something animistic. I had a lot of fun writing that article. I hope you have fun reading it. And then I realized, translating this idea of the agency of the powerless and the vulnerable, translating it into a concrete logic of curatorial practice and artistic practice, so bringing it right into this question of, well, how do you practice art, or how do you curate, drawing from this idea of animism as ritual of the powerless. I realized that a lot of it revolves around making yourself vulnerable to unpredictable the unpredictability of the space and the event. So making yourself vulnerable that way. A lot of the dynamic of animistic rituals incorporate improvisation. So improvisation becomes key. It also involves complicating the idea of who participates and who doesn't, so that participation doesn't hang on whether somebody believes in animism or not. And that was something that in the process of actually trying to do this curatorial field trip and working with the projectionists, I got a more concrete and sensorial sense of that, in that participating in this dispositive of animistic film projection doesn't hang on belief. If you're the projectionist who takes on the commission to do the projection, you don't necessarily have to believe in spirits or ghosts to do it. So I was trying to find a way, myself and the sort of my fellow artists and curators, we were sort of playing around with this idea that to make yourself vulnerable to these scenarios of animistic ritual, if you're in the sort of, in that space, you are already the participant. Whether you believe or not is irrelevant. And in this article, you will come across some of the stories in there were stories about what took place during our 3 nights of improvisation and field trip, whereby there were occurrences of a supernatural nature. And in the storytelling that I told, I had a lot of fun trying to find a form of telling this story so that it wasn't really relevant whether you believe that those supernatural occurrences occurred or not. It was more a matter of who sensed it and who didn't, and how did the sensing by some of those supernatural practices, supernatural occurrences, then shape what we did, what we did afterwards as a consequence of the sensing. It no longer mattered whether some people believed and some people didn't. Those who generally don't believe in ghosts were still participants in that space and time, where in that space and time of animistic projection and happening. So a really sort of fascinating thing here then became, well, what do we do after that sensing by some? How does that change the way that we organized our event?
Okay, thanks, May. So there are last question from Alexander Supartono. He said, "Thank you very much for the brilliant presentation, May. Your curatorial practice offers possible solution for the orientalistic divide between the tradition and modern, as well ritual and technology. I was wondering if this divide was speeded up by, or even particular to, the lens-based modern visual technology in Southeast Asia."
Thanks, Alex, for that really astute comment. I'm almost tempted to bring you in so that you can reflect on this comment more, and maybe based on the work that you do on early photography, because and here I think it ties in really nicely with a comment we had earlier on, which I take as a comment about the ambivalences or the dialectics of ritual practice, traditional practice, animistic practice. And the dialectics to me, also myth actually. And this approach to myth, I'm very influenced by Lavdias's work, his very interesting approach to myth. as that which could be a tool for domination, suppression, colonization, but also that as that which could be a tool for another kind of knowledge, for resistance, for breaking free, for decolonial, decolonizing ways of doing. And I think in your comment, there is something in here, isn't there? The localization of modern visual technology, the dialectics there, in what circumstances that gets used as a tool of colonization and domination, and in what circumstances we see possibilities of something else. And to me, theoretically, how you speculate or how you trace that possibility of something else is that you undermine the distinction of tradition versus model, and you think again about tradition, what the potentiality of tradition is in the present.
Okay, May, thank you very much for the presentation. Oh, this is there is a question from Hafiz, and I will read it on Bahasa Indonesia.
Okay.
Ya,
Pertanyaan dari Hafiz, di tradisi wayang ada kepercayaan yang melekat pada penontonnya. Jadi, apa yang terjadi dalam peristiwa pertunjukan wayang adalah penonton dan dalam masuk dalam ruang yang sama, sehingga ada relasi yang saling mengerti di antara keduanya. Nah, dalam film ada hal yang mungkin berjarak karena sejarah mediumnya yang sangat material. Bagaimana itu bisa dileburkan dalam sebuah peristiwa sinematik itu saat roh-roh itu tidak ada bagi penonton. Silakan May.
I think you start by trying to describe very precisely what are the procedures by which the spirit appears. Well, appear is a bad word, but you know what I mean. What are the procedures by which the spirit is present? This idea, I was influenced by that book on Southeast Asian animism. So animism as a communicative logic, there is what is the sort of the logic of communication, which is quite circular. There's a sort of self-referential logic going on here. So what are the procedures by which the spirit is present? This, in the context of animistic film projection, this interested me a lot, because suddenly when you ask that question, the role of the projectionist is really important. The projectionist as the mediator of the making present of the spirit. But the projectionist himself or herself doesn't have to be the believer. The projectionist is not the host who commissions, right? Who initiates this event? It's the host, because the host wants something, but the host doesn't have to be present during the projection event for the spirit to be present. So it's a very head-turning kind of procedural logic. Though the person who initiates the whole chain of communication doesn't even have to be there in the event of addressing the spirit. The human agent who has to be there to make this event of addressing the spirit, and therefore to make present the spirit in the space and time of the ritual event, turns out doesn't have to be a believer. So I don't know whether then you can, with that, a little bit more precise description of the procedural logic of making the spirit present. I don't know whether then we have a basis for really interesting comparative thought, right, on animistic film projection and wayang. What are the similarities or what are the differences in the procedural logic of making present this human spirit ecology, a kind of performance event as a making present of human spirit ecology.
Oke, thanks May. Ini pembicaraan yang sangat menarik ya sebenarnya, kalau kita lanjutkan bisa sampai masih lama. Tapi sekarang waktu sudah ada di penghujung acara. Terima kasih May atas presentasinya yang sangat bagus, yang sangat menarik. Dan teman-teman juga terima kasih para audiens yang sudah datang secara virtual dan menyaksikan dan ikut berdiskusi. Dan nanti jam 7 malam masih akan ada panel 1 forum festival yang berjudul Bahasa-Bahasa yang Mungkin, The Possible Languages of Cinema, yang akan presentasi adalah Afrian Purnama dari Jurnal Footage, dan yang kedua adalah Fujita Guha. Oke, itu dulu mungkin. Terima kasih banyak May, sudah sangat bagus sekali presentasinya. Saya sangat senang.
Thank you everyone and for all your really rich questions and for staying throughout the long conversation. And I hope you have a great festival. There's some great works being shown, so catch as much of it as you can.
Thank you, May.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Ya, terima kasih teman-teman. Saya akhiri forum ini. Selamat sore.
Bye.
Bye.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, sama-sama.